In this video we will learn about the different phases of the war. World War I, also known as the Great War, lasted from the 28th of July 1914 to the 11th of November 1918. It is indeed one of the deadliest conflicts in history and set the stage for another world war, 20 years later. It was called the Great War, a terrible war in land, air and sea that killed over 8 million military personnel and 6.6 million civilians. World War I was fought between the Allied powers and the Central Powers. The main members of the Allied powers were France, Russia, and Britain. The United States also fought on the side of the Allies after 1917. The main members of the Central Powers were Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria. Combined with the fierce Allied resistance in France, the ability of Russia's huge war machine to mobilize relatively quickly in the East ensured a longer, more grueling conflict instead of the quick victory Germany had hoped to win under the Schlieffen Plan. Hence, World War I was a whole compilation of many wars. Phases of the war. Phase 1. Austria-Hungary declares war against Serbia. It began with the assassinations on the 28th of June of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife, Sophie, at Sarajevo by Gavrilo Princip. Franz Ferdinand was the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. He fell victim to what would now be called state-sponsored terrorism. Princip was an ethnic Serb from Bosnia, which Austria-Hungary had annexed in 1908. He belonged to a revolutionary nationalist group that wanted to liberate the South Slav peoples from foreign rule and unite them in a new state of Yugoslavia. The conspirators had received their weapons from Serbian military intelligence and been trained in Belgrade, although the Serbian civilian government had not been involved. It was therefore unsurprising that Austria-Hungary made drastic demands on Serbia in an ultimatum delivered on the 23rd of July. But the Austro-Hungarian leaders wanted to use the assassinations to provoke a war, and to a British radical such as David Lloyd George, their conduct amounted to bullying. When Serbia failed to accept all of the demands, Austria-Hungary declared war on the 28th of July. Phase 2. The conflicts widens to Germany, Russia and France. Austria-Hungary's leaders ruled a multinational empire and felt that Serbian-backed separatism threatened its survival. By 1913, they had decided that only force could solve the problem. They knew a war against Serbia was almost certain to escalate, and before sending the ultimatum, they consulted their ally, Germany, whose leaders urged Austria-Hungary to use force and promised backing if Russia intervened. From their perspective, Austria-Hungary was their one reliable great power ally, and enemies ringed them. France and Russia had allied in 1891–94, and Britain had cooperated with them since 1904. Germany had conducted a battleship building race against Britain and an army race against France and Russia, and since 1905 the two blocs had clashed repeatedly over Morocco and the Balkans. The German leaders were readier to risk war because they believed the current military balance favored them but would soon deteriorate. But if Germany threw down a challenge, Russia was quick to respond. Once Austria-Hungary sent the ultimatum, Russia began military preparations, and after war was declared on Serbia, Russia ordered general mobilization, the 31st of July, placing its forces on a war footing. Russia's leaders were willing to accept a European conflict rather than abandon Serbia, partly because of Slav solidarity but more to protect their own interests in the Balkans and because they saw Germany as a danger. They had recently strengthened their army and expected France to support them. Phase 3. Germany invades Luxembourg and Belgium, Britain intervenes. Germany and France had been at odds since the Franco-Prussian War of 1870–71, after which Germany had annexed the French provinces of Alsace-Lorraine. The French remembered the loss, although they would not have started a war over it. Germany's strategy, for a war against France, and Russia envisaged first defeating France quickly, outflanking France's border fortresses by invading via Luxembourg and Belgium. Once Russia mobilized, which the Germans feared would undermine their war plan, the Germans declared war on both Russia and France and demanded that Belgium allow them to cross its territory. Britain, Germany, and France had all committed themselves to respect Belgian independence by the 1839 Treaty of London. The issue swung the doubters in the British cabinet as Germany failed to comply with a demand to respect Belgium. On the 4th of August, Britain declared war. In 1914, Balkan crisis coincided with high tension between Europe's opposing power blocs. For decades, the continent had enjoyed relative peace, and many had believed that war was becoming obsolete. Some called for a common language such as Esperanto. Now, anti-war opposition collapsed, because events moved too quickly and the full facts of the crisis remained hidden, and because each government could present the conflict as a defensive struggle forced on it by the enemy. Partly for this reason, pro-war consensus generally remained solid, until 1917. Phase 4, the tipping point of the war. Two great events came to turn the tide of the war in 1917, the US entry into the war in April and Russia out of the conflict in December. United States had remained neutral in the conflict but had supplied the Entente countries. The Germans decided to undertake submarine warfare, a risky tactic of attacking and sinking not only British or French ships but also attacking neutral shipping. The sinking of several American ships, with the consequent loss of lives, eventually led President Wilson to declare war on the Central Powers. Popular discontent with the progress of the war in Russia culminated in a revolution that overthrew the Tsar in March and brought to power the Bolsheviks, communists, in November. Lenin's new government signed the armistice with the Central Powers in December. Russia left the war. Hence, in March 1918, Russia signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with the Central Powers. As a consequence, the leaving of the war by revolutionary Russia allowed Germany to concentrate their forces on the Western Front. The summer of 1918 witnessed the last desperate German attacks. However, Germany was practically alone. His allies were on the verge of military and economic exhaustion. The arrival of US troops in Europe balanced the scales in favor of the Entente. Bulgaria asked the armistice in September, Turkey in October, and Austria-Hungary surrendered in early November. In Germany, a revolution overthrew Wilhelm II, who had to flee to Holland. The new democratic regime had to sign the German armistice on November 11, 1918. The war was over. The First World War was a horror of gas, industrialized slaughter, fear, and appalling human suffering. Nick Harkaway, 2012.